Hi, welcome to this episode of Faith and Logic. In this episode of Faith and Logic, we are going to look at different rapture views. We have already seen the origin of the word rapture, the etymology, and we have seen the difference between rapture and the second coming of Jesus Christ. So, in this video, we are going to examine the different rapture views. Now, I personally hold the pre-tribulation rapture view, but we are going to examine all the different 6 views on the rapture. So let's just begin by this video by talking about the list of different views on rapture. Now the first view, it's called partial rapture. That means only those watching and waiting, they will be caught up. Then the second view is pre-tribulation rapture, as the name suggests, the rapture before the 7-year tribulation period. Then the third one is called mid-tribulation rapture. Those people who hold this view, they believe that rapture will happen in the middle of the tribulation, so after the 3.5 years of the tribulation. Then the fourth view is called the pre-wrath view. According to this view, rapture will happen near the end of the tribulation period, just before the wrath of God, and that will be like a 3/4 rapture. The fifth view is called the post-tribulation rapture, that, as the name suggests, post means after. So rapture at the end of the tribulation. And the sixth view is called preterism. And again, preterism is divided into partial preterism and full preterism. So we are going to examine all these different views and the different arguments that the theologian give those who hold to that position. So let's just begin by talking about the partial rapture view. Now, the arguments in favor of this view are final resurrection is the reward to be strived for. Only those who are worthy, they are the one who will be raptured. The parable of the 10 virgins indicate that only some were prepared for the Lord's coming and the rest were left behind. Those taken will be taken in judgment, and like those taken in flood, they are not those who will be raptured. The New Testament emphasis on watching and waiting implies that not all will be raptured. So by sin, a believer can forfeit his right to the rapture and not enter the kingdom. So according to this partial rapture view, only those watching and worthy, they are the one who will be raptured. Now let's look at the second view, which is called the pre-tribulation view. Now, according to this view, right now we are in the church age. The next thing which is going to happen, according to the God's prophetic calendar, that is the rapture of the church. Then the tribulation will begin. It is for the 7 years. And after the 7 year of tribulation, there will be the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, this view preserves the imminency and distinction between Israel and the church. Arguments in favor, those who hold to this view, they believe that the church is never mentioned on earth during the tribulation. The church mentioned in heaven during the tribulation. So this means that in the book of Revelation from chapter 6 to chapter 18, church is not mentioned there. Now the tribulation references earthly believers, not the church. In the tribulation period, there are references, for example, in Revelation chapter 7, Revelation chapter 14, which talks about the saints. Tribulation references are earthly believers, not the church. There are some instances, for example, Revelation chapter 7, Revelation chapter 14, where John is taken up, which is called the telescopic view, where he's seeing the future. The church is mentioned in the heaven during the tribulation, not on earth. So church is already been raptured. So church is delivered from the hour of testing. Church is saved from the God's wrath, as we read in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 9 and 10, as well as we can read that in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 10. Church rapture explains sudden apostasy. Now, imminence implies a pre-tribulation rapture. So imminence means that we do not know when the rapture will happen. That is the doctrine of imminency. According to doctrine of imminency, it is going to happen all of a sudden while nobody expected. The doctrine of imminency is only possible with this particular view, which is a pre-tribulation view. Now, church is not destined for the Jacob's trouble. There are many scripture passages that we can look at that talks about this. that the church is not going to go through the tribulation. It says there are differences between rapture and the second coming. They imply the pre-tribulation view. That means that the rapture and the second coming is separated by the 7-year period, which we call it as tribulation period. Ship's nation going to the millennium, that supports the pre-tribulation rapture. At the end of the tribulation, there will be sheep and goat judgment, and the sheep nations, they will be going into the millennium period. So that theory also supports the pre-tribulation view. I personally hold the pre-tribulation view, but we are going to look at all these different views and look at the argument that people give for each particular view. So now let's look at the third view, which is called the mid-tribulation view. As the name suggests, the rapture, according to this view, is going to happen at the midpoint of the tribulation, which is after first half, 3.5 years of the tribulation period. Now, the imminency is weakened according to this view because you already know when the rapture is going to happen. Only according to the pre-trib view, you do not know when the rapture is going to happen. But if you hold this particular view, mid-tribulation view, then you know, and any other view, for example, post-tribulation or mid-tribulation or pre-wrath view, you already know when the rapture is going to happen. So in the other views, the doctrine of imminency is not correct. Now, arguments which are in favor of this particular view is that this view explains verses that seems to place the rapture before the great tribulation but after the tribulation. They take some of the verse that explains the rapture which is before the great tribulation. So according to this particular view, people who hold this view, they think that only the last 3.5 years of the tribulation are the great tribulation, and in the first 3.5 years there is going to be peace, and it's not actually the great tribulation. It's just the beginning of the birth pain, as Matthew 24 says. But when we look at in context, all 7 years or the entire tribulation period, that can be called as great tribulation, because there will be God's wrath poured out during the first 3.5 years as well. There will be famine, earthquake. By the time the fourth seal is broken, 1/4 of the world population is dead. That is tribulation. The people who will be left behind on the earth, they will face the tribulation. So entire 7-year period, that can be called as great tribulation. Now, according to this view, people who hold this view, they think that Paul seems to specify that there are signs prior to the rapture, which are part of the tribulation. Again, this view doesn't hold the doctrine of imminency. Church will be delivered from the wrath, which is the second half, but not the tribulation itself, which is the first half. That means in the first 3.5 years, church will be on the earth, and then it will be delivered from the wrath, which is the second half of the tribulation period. Now, the division between the 2-3.5 year period, they support the mid-tribulation. The people who hold this view, they think that is the reason the tribulation period is been divided into 3.5 and 3.5 year period. Now, people who advocate for this view hold that seventh trumpet is in the middle of the tribulation period. So people who hold this view, they think that seventh trumpet is in the middle of the tribulation, which is not true, because the trumpet judgment, which are more severe judgment, which are pushed to the second part or the second half of the tribulation period. So that is according to the pre-tribulation view. So this view, which is called the mid-tribulation view, and these are the arguments that people give in favor of this particular view. Now, the next one is pre-wrath view. As the name suggests, the church will be raptured before the wrath of God. And according to theologians who hold this particular view, they think that the wrath of man is the first sixth seal, and the wrath of God comes only with the seventh seal. So according to this pre-wrath view, the rapture is going to happen sometime between the sixth and the seventh seal. According to this view, church experiences most of the tribulation. The rapture occurs before God's final wrath. Now, the arguments in favor are People who hold this view, they think that this view explains the supposed difference between the day of the Lord and the great tribulation. Believers are promised deliverance from the wrath, but not the tribulation. So, again, this view does not explain the imminency of the Christ's coming. You already know when the rapture is going to happen. It is going to be between sixth and seventh seal judgment, according to this particular view. That is the pre-wrath view. Now, the next view is called the post-tribulation view. Now, there are many people who hold to this particular view, which is the post-tribulation view. According to this view, the church will go through the tribulation. Church will endure the entire tribulation. The rapture and the second coming occur together. So, according to this view, the rapture of the church is going to happen at the end of the tribulation. So, the church will be lifted up, and then again, the saints will come back with the Jesus' second coming. Now, there are certain reasons why this view is not the true view. There are people who hold to this view and they give the arguments such as rapture is preceded by the clear signs. They will give arguments that the rapture is not going to happen all of a sudden, but it is preceded by there are clear signs in the scripture. Parable of wheat and tares indicates Christ's return at the end. Revelation chapter 20, verse 4 to 6 says that it is the first resurrection and indicates believers will be resurrected at the end. Now, the people who hold on to the pre-tribulation rapture view, according to them, the first resurrection is going to happen in two stages. The first stage would be the rapture of the church, and the second stage of the first resurrection would be from the Revelation chapter 20, verse 4 to 6, after the tribulation period is over at the second coming of Jesus Christ. So clearly, if you look at literally and interpret the prophecy in the literal grammatical view, this view is not the true view. People who hold to this view, they will say New Testament makes no distinction between rapture and the second coming. Revelation chapter 3 and verse 10 can mean saved from the Satan's wrath while the tribulation is going on. People who hold on to the pre-tribulation rapture view, as we discussed earlier, one of the argument is that the church is preserved from the tribulation is from Revelation chapter 3 and verse 10. But the post-tribulation view holds that the church is saved from the Satan's wrath while tribulation is going on. So that means that the church is going to endure the tribulation time. Apostasy is a sign that will precede Christ's return. So they will interpret some of the verses in Matthew 24 as the sign of rapture. Apostasy is one of the sign which is mentioned there and in several other passages. Now, much of Christ's teaching about the end time is meaningless if it doesn't apply to the church. So in that case, they will say that the church has to go through the tribulation period. According to this view, the plain reading of 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 verse 6 to 10 argues for the post-tribulation position. And finally, the last trumpet in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 52 aligns with the last trumpet in Matthew 24 verse 31. This is also not true. The trumpet which is mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 52 is not the last trumpet. If you have read the book of Revelation carefully, you may notice that there are many other trumpet after this first trumpet. So this view is not the right view, post-tribulation view. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 52, that talks about the rapture with a twinkling of an eye. Paul says, I'm telling you a mystery. You will be transformed with a twinkling of an eye. When the trumpet is blown, the corruptible shall be raised in incorruptible, the mortal in immortality. So that is talking about the rapture, and clearly that is not the last trumpet. As we will see some of the arguments against this view that will give the responses to some of these arguments made in the favor of the post-tribulation view. So let's just examine some of the arguments against the post-tribulation view. So there are no glorified sheep left to go into the millennium to die or bear children. According to Isaiah 65 and some of these other passages, there will be children who will be born during the millennium. But if we hold the post-tribulation arguments that the church will be raptured, then they will be coming back with Jesus Christ, then there will be no unglorified ships who are left behind to go into the millennium period in their mortal bodies, and they cannot bear children. In Revelation chapter 19 shows the church, the bride already married. It's aorist past tense, Revelation chapter 19 and verse 7, and coming back with Christ. So going up and then immediately coming back, that does not make sense. With post tribulation, there will be signs such that you cannot know how much time before Christ comes back. But this doesn't align with the other verses on the imminency. Post tribulation view, if you hold to this position, then the doctrine of imminency is not correct, because you clearly know when the Christ will come back or when the rapture is going to happen. That is after the tribulation. Whereas if you hold to the pre-tribulation rapture view, then you actually do not know when the Christ is going to come back. Fourth argument against the post-tribulation view is God saves his righteous from his wrath. In Genesis 18 and verse 25, the entire 7 years of tribulation is the time of God's wrath. As we argued before, that it's not the only last 3.5 year period, but entire 7 year of the tribulation period is the wrath of God. And God will save his righteous, as we see in the case of Lot in the Old Testament. God saved his people. For example, Noah's family. Lot, they were saved from the God's wrath. Now, the fifth argument against the post-tribulation view is that 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 speaks of vindication and justice. Post-tribulation interpretation is problematic and not viable interpretation. The sixth argument is that the trumpet in the 1 Corinthians chapter 15:52, as we discussed earlier, is not the very last trumpet as the post-tribulation advocates might claim. Seventh argument is that the first resurrection in Revelation chapter 20 and verse 5 is not the true chronological first. This is the final judgment marker in contrast to the second. So actually, the first resurrection can be divided into two halves. The first one would be the rapture, and the second half would be after the tribulation at the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, Matthew chapter 25, verse 32, he will separate the sheep from the goat. But he would not need to do this if they were previously raptured. So again, if the church was raptured at the end of the tribulation period and then coming back with Christ in the glorified body, then there is no need to separate the sheep from the goats, as the church is raptured. All the believers are raptured after the tribulation. So there is no need to separate the sheep from the goat. Now, church is seen in heaven in Revelation during the tribulation. As we discussed earlier, when we read Revelation chapter 6 to chapter 18, we see the church is in heaven. There is no mention of church in those chapters. Revelation chapter 3 and verse 10 cannot be interpreted in the post-trib safe way, because then something goes horribly wrong, because believers are martyred. So there is one rule that we can follow while interpreting the prophecy. When literal sense makes sense, make no other sense unless it results in nonsense. So as much as possible, you have to interpret it literally. So if you are interpreting the gospel literally, and then all of a sudden, when it comes to prophecy, there are people who try to interpret that spiritually. And sometimes interpreting spiritually would make no sense. Again, Revelation chapter 3 verse 10 cannot be interpreted as a post-trib in a safe way. Let's look at the sixth view, which is called preterism. The meaning of preterism is past or beyond. So there are two forms of preterism. One is called partial preterism, and the second one is called full preterism. Now, the partial preterism view holds that there is no future tribulation, as it was already fulfilled when the Romans destroyed the temple between 64 to 70 AD. So in 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple, and that was a kind of a tribulation period. The full preterism is an unorthodox position, because this view particularly denies the second coming as a whole. So they do not believe that there will be a second coming of Jesus Christ. So that is an unorthodox position. Now, what are the arguments in favor of partial preterism? The people who hold to this view, they say that preterism is said to exist in some early church fathers and some reformers and post-reformers writers. Jesus speaking to you implies only immediate disciples. Generation, Jesus talks about this generation will not pass away. So generation implies immediate future. So they hold some of this Jesus' teaching that the tribulation has already happened in 70 AD. Now, Jesus said he would return before disciples had evangelized the cities. So, again, that is just a misinterpretation of Jesus' teaching. Jesus said some standing would not die until they saw him return, coming with his kingdom. Now, again, Jesus, right after this verse, if you have seen the Gospels, the next event that happens is the transfiguration of Jesus. And you can see partially that is the shadow of Jesus coming or the Jesus's return as they saw Jesus in the glory. This verse can be interpreted in that way also, that then right after this, when Jesus said some standing would not die until they saw him return, the next event that happens is the transfiguration of Jesus. According to the people who hold partial preterism, they say that if tribulation was worldwide, then makes no sense to flee to the mountains. Now again, that's not true. Events already took place between 68 to 70 AD according to this view, with Jewish wars and destruction of Jerusalem. Luke 21 is parallel to Matthew 24, yet many futurists believe Luke 21 was fulfilled. People who hold to partial preterism, they think that Luke 21 was already fulfilled. Revelation is a book of symbols and should not be taken literally. Again, the same point which I addressed before, that when you're trying to interpret something literally and then all of a sudden you switch to spiritually, then sometimes that makes no sense. Revelation is a book of symbols. There are many symbols there, but John also tells you the meaning of it. For example, when he says seven lampstand, John interprets that these are the seven churches in Asia Minor. So even though it's in symbols, you have the literal seven churches who existed at the time of John in Asia Minor. That is how you can understand the symbols, and the symbols have literal meaning behind it. Now, many times when Jesus said, for example, in Revelation chapter 22, when he says, I come quickly or I come soon, my coming is near, that soon in a Greek language that can be understood as it can happen anytime or it can happen all of a sudden when nobody expected it. And that is the doctrine of imminency. So soon does not mean immediately or during the lifetime of the disciple, but soon means it can happen anytime. So rapture can happen at any time. And that is the doctrine of imminency. So let's just conclude this video. After seeing all these different views, we need to understand that the Orthodox Christians can disagree about these different views on millennium. For example, there are people who hold to amillennialism. That means that there is no literal millennium. There are people who hold to post-millennialism. They believe that Christ returns after the millennium period. In the premillennialism, that says Christ returns before the millennium, there are all these different rapture views. Now, all these different views falls under premillennialism, as we have discussed: partial rapture, pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, pre-wrath, post-tribulation, and preterism, which is the partial preterism. As we have discussed already, full preterism is an unorthodox position that holds that there will be no second coming of Jesus Christ. I hope this episode was helpful for you to understand the different views on rapture. And I personally hold the pre-tribulation rapture, that Christ will rapture the church before the tribulation. But it's good to know all these different views, because whenever someone tries to interpret the book of Revelation or several passages from the Thessalonians, and in fact Matthew 24, they come to different conclusion. And that is because of their view on millennium and their view on the rapture theory. So I hope this was helpful for you. Thank you and God bless.